The fire wasn't meant to scare anyone. It was meant to end something. 2 in the morning, Harlem still breathing, still awake in pockets when the back end of a counting house on 133rd caught first. Not loud, not sloppy, just enough flame to eat paper faster than men could think. Cash curled up. Ink bled. Ledgers screamed without sound. Someone wanted the books gone. Someone wanted a message delivered with heat. By the time the sirens figured out where to scream, the work was already finished. Money that fed whole blocks turned to smoke. Years of quiet control reduced to black dust drifting through open windows. Upstairs, the woman who owned the night stood barefoot on cold floorboards, silk hanging loose on her shoulders. No panic in her face, just calculation. You don't survive Harlem that long by panicking. They tried to save the books, they always try. Fire don't care about loyalty. Then they found the note, pinned clean, untouched, like the flames had been instructed to respect it. Red ink, heavy strokes, no poetry, no signature worth framing, just a demand and a warning sitting on her door like it paid rent there. She didn't read it twice. She didn't need to. Her hand closed around the paper until it tore, jaw set, eyes sharp enough to cut glass. She already knew who thought he was brave enough to do this, and she knew something worse. Fire was only the opening move. The crowd outside didn't see that part. Firemen didn't see it. The man who struck the match definitely didn't. He thought this was pressure, thought this was leverage. What he didn't know was that the one man who understood pressure better than anyone in Harlem had already been expecting smoke. She said his name once, quiet, like a prayer you don't repeat. That name carried weight because it didn't chase attention. It waited, it watched, it showed up after mistakes were already made. And this was a mistake. Harlem in those days didn't forgive miscalculations. Not with speeches, not with apologies. It corrected them in ways people remembered. Especially when someone forgot who taught them how to survive. Somewhere across the city, a man adjusted his hat, read the ash in the air, and understood exactly what kind of game had just been started. He didn't rush. He didn't call anyone. Because when fire shows up first, betrayal is already standing close behind. And betrayal, when handled properly, never ends quickly. It ends publicly. The night wasn't over. It was just deciding who would still be standing when morning came. By sunrise, everybody had an opinion. By noon, nobody had the truth. Harlem was buzzing the way it does when something big breaks quiet rules. Men leaned too close in barbershops. Women lowered their voices in doorways. Runners stopped smiling. When money burns, fear counts faster than cash. The woman whose house had been touched sat still at her table, smoke still living in the curtains. Papers laid out like bodies after a bad night. She wasn't crying. She wasn't raging. She was waiting. That knock came the way only one man knocked. Not loud, not polite. 3 short taps that said, "I'm already inside the situation." Stepped in like time hadn't moved. Suit pressed, hat low. Eyes doing the work before his mouth ever thought about speaking. He didn't ask if she was all right. Men like him don't waste words on answers they already know. She slid what was left of the note across the table. He read it slow, not because it was hard, because patience makes people nervous. Someone close had gotten ambitious. Someone close had gotten greedy. Someone close thought protection was ownership. He asked questions that sounded simple. Numbers, gaps, time. She answered without drama. The kind of answers that don't need explaining. Money missing. Roots exposed. Payments that never came back the way they were supposed to. That's when it became clear this wasn't an outside attack. This was a man inside the house moving furniture around while pretending to help clean. A protege with good suits and bad timing. The kind of man who thinks loyalty has an expiration date. The kind of man who forgets who kept him breathing long enough to start dreaming. The name landed heavy between them. It didn't need repeating. She wanted him breathing when it was over. That part mattered. She wanted the lesson to walk around after. Wanted every mirror in Harlem to remind him of the price of imagination. The man in the hat didn't smile, but something settled in his eyes. The math had finished itself. He already knew where the boy would be next. He already knew who the boy thought he was impressing. And he already knew the boy believed he'd outgrown consequences. That belief was dangerous, because confidence without permission gets men buried. He stood, straightened his jacket, and said it calmly, like he was discussing the weather, not a reckoning. "Let him keep performing," he said. "Crowds make lessons stick." Across town, the young man responsible for the fire was moving loud, collecting money like it belonged to him, letting people see him, letting them talk. That's how you know someone thinks the board is already won. He hadn't seen the other hand yet. He walked into the bank like it was already his name on the door. Good suit. Too clean for the neighborhood. Rings heavy enough to remind people he was getting paid. 6 men around him, all muscle, no memory. The kind of crew that thinks numbers on paper mean power in the street. The old man behind the counter hesitated. That hesitation almost cost him his teeth. Money changed hands fast. No receipts, no respect, just assumption. The young man smiled for the room. He liked rooms, liked witnesses, thought silence meant agreement. He made sure everyone understood the old order was done. Then the room shifted, not loud, not sudden, just different. There's a way a space tightens when someone dangerous is present, like air realizing it's about to get used up. He was sitting in the corner, coffee cooling, newspaper folded, not watching anybody, which is how everybody knew exactly who he was. The young man froze for half a heartbeat, long enough for fear to introduce itself. His crew felt it too. Hands got close to waistbands. Mistakes started lining up. The man in the corner didn't raise his voice, didn't even raise his eyes at first. He spoke like he was correcting a small error. "You touched what wasn't yours." The young man tried laughter, tried confidence. Lies came easy. They always do when someone hasn't been tested yet. The man finally looked up. That stare didn't threaten, it measured. He named things only someone on the inside could know. Missing money, false stories, routes that had been sold cheap to the wrong people. Each word peeled something off the young man's face. The warning was simple, elegant, public. There would be a party. There would be witnesses. There would be a chance to fix what he broke. Or there would be something else. The man stood, passed him close enough for truth to land where it hurts most, and left the way he came in, without urgency, without looking back. The young man stayed standing long after the door closed, heart racing, crew watching, pride screaming at him not to bend. But fear had already started making plans, because now he understood something too late. The fire wasn't the climax, it was the invitation. The party was supposed to crown him. That was the idea. Lights, music, food stacked high, important faces pressed together pretending they didn't recognize each other outside this room. A celebration dressed up as respectability. Harlem loved those. So did men who thought paperwork could erase blood. He arrived smiling. That same suit. That same confidence stretched a little thinner now. He shook hands too hard, laughed too loud, kept checking corners without meaning to. He told himself the warning was theater, old men clinging to old rules. He told himself this was momentum, that once papers were signed in front of the right people, history would agree with him. That's how ambition lies. It sounds like logic. She entered without hurry, head high, diamonds calm. The room shifted for her the way water parts for something heavier. She didn't look at him. That cut deeper than anger. And next to her, already seated, already settled, was the man who never needed an invitation. Same suit, same stillness, like he'd been there all night waiting for the room to catch up. That's when the young man understood the trap had been built around him, not for him. Music softened. Voices lowered, eyes leaned in. He tried to keep control, tried to make it official, tried to rush the moment before it slipped away. Words came out sharper than he planned, demands dressed as business. The man answered him once. Quiet, final, sit. Power doesn't shout, it assumes. The room felt it. So did the 6 men behind him. Hands twitched, sweat appeared. Loyalty got nervous, the accusations came clean. No dramatics, just facts laid bare in front of people who already suspected the truth but didn't want to say it out loud. He denied it, of course he did. Standing was all he had left. Then the lights died, not by accident. Darkness swallowed the room whole. Panic rushed in where confidence used to be. Chairs scraped. Someone screamed. Someone fired blind. That's when movement happened. Not wild, not rushed, precise. In the dark, experience beats youth every time. When the lights came back, the floor was full of regret. Bodies twisted, pride broken, guns useless. And the young man stood alone, breathing too fast, realizing the room hadn't turned against him. It had always been against the mistake he became. He felt steel kiss his skin and knew finally exactly how expensive fire could be. He begged, not for power, for life. The answer was mercy with a memory attached, a lesson that would walk with him forever. The room exhaled as one when it was over. Music returned like nothing happened. Plates refilled. Conversations resumed. But nobody forgot, because some lessons don't need repeating. They just need witnesses. And every man in that room knew. The game had just been reset. He left the city before the swelling went down. Bandage wrapped tight, head low, pride leaking through gauze, no goodbyes, no second chances, just distance. Distance is what men chase when they realize they bet wrong. The envelope he carried so proudly never made it with him, left behind on a floor that didn't respect him anymore, stepped on, forgotten, like his plans. The call went out the next morning, short, direct. No threats dressed up as conversation. Just reality delivered clean. Lines were redrawn without argument, operations folded, doors closed quiet, no retaliation. That's how you know fear did its job. Power doesn't always rule. Sometimes it just removes itself from your life and leaves you smaller than you were before. A few months later, the woman stepped away the right way. On her terms, no fire, no pressure. She handed control to the man who never asked for it but always carried it. The streets understood. They always do. Stories grew after that. They always do too. Men told them wrong, but the ending stayed the same. About how a room full of witnesses watched a mistake get corrected. About how violence wasn't the point. Control was. That's what separated him from the others. He didn't chase chaos, he used it, let it expose people, let it reveal who thought too small. You could lock him up, starve him, burn what he protected. None of that touched the real weapon. The mind stays free. And when the mind is 3 moves ahead, the outcome is already written. Harlem learned it again that night, quietly, permanently. Because in this city, respect doesn't come from noise. It comes from knowing exactly when to speak and exactly when to cut. The game didn't end there, it never does. It just waits for the next man who thinks fire is enough. Years later, men would swear they were there. They weren't. But that's how Harlem legends work. Everybody wants proximity to the moment when the rules were enforced properly. The scar moved faster than the man who carried it, beat him into every room, got there first, whispered warnings before he ever opened his mouth. Doors closed early. Conversations ended quick. Nobody needed introductions. He learned how exile really works, not distance. Irrelevance. Back in Harlem, things settled into their natural order. Banks ran smooth. Runners smiled again. Cops stayed paid. Italians stayed cautious. Peace returned, but not the soft kind, the kind built on memory. And the man at the center of it all, he didn't celebrate. He never did. He watched from windows, from corners, from silence. He understood something most men never learn. Victory makes noise, control doesn't. People mistook that quiet for mercy. They shouldn't have. Because every so often someone new would come along. Fresh suit, fresh idea, same mistake. Thinking the city had forgotten who owned the board. Thinking the lesson had expired. That's when the old-timers would shake their heads. Tell them about a fire that didn't finish the job. About a party that wasn't what it seemed. About a man who never raised his voice but ended arguments permanently. And if the warning didn't land, well, Harlem still remembered how to teach. The streets don't age, they don't forgive, they just wait. And somewhere in that waiting, another man was already convincing himself he was smarter than the past. That belief has a way of calling the wrong kind of attention. And when it does, the lesson always comes back around. The dangerous thing about time is it makes people careless. New faces start thinking old names are just stories. Warnings turn into folklore. Fear softens around the edges. That's when trouble starts stretching its legs again. It always begins small. A number shaved here. A runner paid late there. Whisper that maybe the man at the top isn't watching like he used to. That's how the city tests you. Not with guns, with curiosity. He felt it before anyone said it out loud. The rhythm shifted. Money moved funny. Too many smiles from people who used to lower their eyes. He didn't confront it, didn't ask questions, he listened. Because men only slip when they think nobody's counting. Somewhere, a new player was putting pieces on the board, quiet about it, careful, smart enough to avoid fire, dumb enough to think subtle meant invisible. That kind of man doesn't announce himself. He waits for an opening. And Harlem, patient as ever, offered one. A meeting got scheduled. Nothing official, just business dressed as conversation. Neutral ground, neutral faces. Everybody pretending the past was the past. He agreed to attend, not because he trusted it, because traps tell you more about the man who builds them than the man who walks into them. That night, as he buttoned his jacket and checked his reflection, he already knew something was off. Too much quiet. Too many moving parts lining up too clean. Someone wanted to see if the legend still breathed. Outside, the streetlights flickered like they were undecided. Somewhere close, a car engine stayed running longer than it needed to. Somewhere higher up, a window stayed dark when it shouldn't have. The city was holding its breath again. And whatever was waiting on the other side of that door wasn't looking for a conversation. It was looking for a turn. He stepped out anyway. Because the most dangerous place in Harlem has always been thinking you're ready, when the game hasn't even shown its hand yet. The meeting spot was wrong, not obvious wrong, careful wrong, too clean, too polite, too many exits pretending not to matter. The kind of place men choose when they want options but don't want witnesses. Harlem had places like that, always had. He arrived alone. That part made people nervous. Inside, the air was thick with restraint. Smiles that didn't reach eyes. Hands that stayed visible on purpose. Everyone acting like tonight was just business, like history wasn't sitting down with them. The new man spoke first. Always a mistake. Smooth voice. Respectful tone. Words chosen like he'd practiced them in a mirror. He talked about partnerships, growth, a future that sounded shared but smelled like takeover. He offered percentages, promises, protection. The man listened without interruption, let the pitch finish breathing. Silence stretched long enough for doubt to creep in. Then he asked one question, not about money, not about territory, about loyalty. The room shifted, chairs adjusted. Someone cleared their throat too late. That's when he knew. The play wasn't to move him, it was to measure him. See if the mind was still sharp. See if the hands still mattered. He stood slowly, calm as ever, no anger, no threat, just certainty. "I'll think about it," he said. Relief washed through the room, too fast, too obvious. As he turned to leave, he caught it. A glance, a signal, a man near the door touching his jacket where nothing legal ever sat. That's when the truth finally showed its face. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an audition for replacement. He stepped outside into the night, street quiet again, but not peaceful. Somewhere behind him, decisions were being reconsidered. Somewhere ahead, consequences were already moving. He didn't look back, didn't need to, because once a man shows you he's willing to test the crown, there are only two outcomes left. And Harlem has never been patient with the wrong choice. The next move wouldn't be loud, but it would be final. The city moved different after that night. Nothing obvious, no bodies, no headlines, just subtle shifts, men changing routes, conversations stopping when certain names came up, a few familiar faces disappearing from their usual corners. That's how corrections happen when done right. He didn't strike immediately. Timing matters more than force. He let the new man feel comfortable again. Let him think the test went unnoticed. Confidence grows fastest when it's fed silence. Behind the scenes, the board rearranged itself. A runner talked too much to someone he shouldn't have trusted. A driver took a shortcut that wasn't his idea. A payment showed up early from a place it never came from before. Patterns don't lie. People do. Within a week, the picture was complete. Not just who wanted the crown, but who was ready to hold the knife for them. Loyalty had been rented, cheap. He didn't confront them together. That's amateur work. He handled each piece where it stood. One man lost protection and learned what the street sounds like when nobody answers. Another found his supply drying up overnight. Phones stopped ringing. Doors stopped opening. No speeches, no warnings, just absence. The new man felt it last. That's always how it goes. Leaders are the last to accept that the ground under them has shifted. By the time he realized the meeting hadn't been a test of strength but a test of intelligence, it was already too late to fix his posture. Another invitation went out. Smaller, quieter, no crowd this time, no stage, just truth in a room with nowhere to hide. He showed up trying to look composed. He left understanding something he should have known from the start. Harlem doesn't overthrow kings, it removes mistakes. And mistakes don't get exit speeches. They get remembered as warnings. The city settled again after that. Calm returned, business flowed, order held. But underneath it all, the lesson stayed sharp. You don't challenge a man who plays the long game unless you're ready to lose slowly and painfully. By the time anyone went looking for him, there was nothing left to find. No body, no funeral, no police report worth reading. Just a name that stopped coming up in conversation, like it had been erased by agreement. That's the cleanest ending a man like that ever gets. Harlem exhaled and kept moving. That's what cities do when balance returns. The wheels don't stop. They just stop squeaking. He stayed where he'd always been, not on stages. Not in headlines. In rooms where decisions are made before anyone realizes they needed to be. People still tested the edges, they always will. But now the tests were quieter, more respectful. Men asked instead of assumed. They remembered to wait their turn because the lesson had traveled far enough. Fire didn't take the throne, ambition didn't, noise didn't, the mind did. That's what made him dangerous. Not the razor, not the reputation, the patience. The way he let men defeat themselves while thinking they were winning. Years from now, someone would tell the story wrong. Add extra blood. Extra shouting. Maybe even a heroic death that never happened. But the truth stayed simple. Harlem never needed a tyrant. It needed a guardian who understood that power only works when it's controlled, and fear only lasts when it's earned. And every time someone forgot that, the city remembered for them, quietly, decisively, forever. The problem with legends is they don't die when the man does. They linger, they sit in the back of rooms, ride shotgun in slow cars, whisper in ears when somebody starts believing their own hype. And sooner or later, somebody decides they're tired of being afraid of a name. That somebody is usually young, usually smart, usually wrong. He heard about it before it reached the street. A new circle forming, different accents, different money. Same hunger. They weren't loud yet, that was the dangerous part. Loud men want attention. Quiet ones want position. They weren't aiming at banks, not yet. They weren't burning anything, not yet. They were studying. Watching who still asked permission. Watching who didn't. Watching how often his name came up and how often it didn't. That's how you know a storm is practicing. He didn't shut it down, didn't send messages, didn't make examples, not immediately. Because force answers questions, but patience exposes intent. He let them grow just enough to feel brave, just enough to think the city had moved on. One night, walking alone like he always did, he felt it again. That shift, that invisible tightening in the air. The kind that tells you someone somewhere just made a decision they can't take back. He stopped under a streetlight that flickered like it was thinking about quitting. Listened to the city breathe. Somewhere nearby, footsteps slowed to match his pace. Somewhere else, a car idled 1 second too long. He smiled, not because it was funny, because it was familiar. Harlem was about to remind someone again that the game never forgets its rules, and neither did he. The knight leaned forward, waiting to see who would move first. He didn't turn around. That's the first mistake people expect. They think awareness means reaction. It doesn't. Awareness means choice. The footsteps stayed measured, not rushing, not retreating. Whoever it was wanted to look disciplined, wanted to look like this was controlled. It was. He crossed the street slow, like an old habit, and felt the echo follow half a second late. Confirmation. Good. He adjusted his pace just enough to let impatience surface behind him. A car rolled past, windows dark, engine whispering. Too clean, too timed. He stopped at the corner. Lit a cigarette. Let the match burn longer than necessary. In that glow, he caught a reflection in a storefront window. Not faces, shapes, positions. 3, maybe 4, young, careful, nervous. They thought tonight was about courage. Thought this was how you announce yourself to a city, by testing the man everyone else still whispered about. He took a drag, exhaled slow. Behind him, someone shifted weight. A shoe scuffed. A breath held too long. That's when he spoke, not loud, not turned. Just enough to let the words land. You boys picked the wrong night. Silence snapped tight, the kind that hurts ears. No one answered. Guns stayed hidden. Decisions stalled mid-thought, because they all felt it at the same time, the realization that this wasn't an ambush. It was an evaluation. And whatever they did next was going to decide how long their names stayed in circulation. He dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his heel, and finally began to turn. But the night interrupted first. A sound cut the air before he finished turning. Metal shifting, not a shot, a mistake. The youngest one flinched first. That told him everything. Fear always leaks from the least experienced hand. The others followed half a beat later, trying to recover posture they never truly had. He finished the turn slow, faces tightened, eyes wide, hands halfway committed to bad ideas. He didn't reach for anything. That's what scared them most. "You don't know this street," he said calmly. "You just think you do." One of them swallowed hard. Another took a step back without meaning to. The car down the block revved, then went quiet again. Nobody wanted to be the first sound. He looked at each of them the way a teacher looks at students who skipped the lesson but still showed up for the test. "You followed me," he continued. "That means you already decided you were ready." No anger, no threat, just truth laid out clean. He stepped closer, close enough for them to smell tobacco and patience, close enough to understand there was no script for this moment. "Here's the part you didn't plan," he said. "I'm not deciding your future tonight." Confusion flickered. Hope tried to breathe. "I'm deciding who's watching you tomorrow." That landed heavier than a gunshot. Because in Harlem, being watched meant every move cost more. Every mistake echoed louder. Every friend started wondering if you were worth the trouble. He stepped past them, brushing shoulders like they were already irrelevant. Behind him, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just stood there, realizing they'd been seen too early and spared too deliberately. As he disappeared down the block, the youngest finally whispered the question none of them wanted to answer. "What do we do now?" The night didn't respond, but Harlem already had. They didn't sleep after that. You could tell by the way they moved the next day, too alert, too careful, like men who suddenly realized the ground had eyes. They started second-guessing each other. That's always step one toward collapse. One of them tried to reassure the others, said it meant nothing, said the old man was bluffing, said watching didn't matter if nobody acted. That man was wrong first. His runner didn't show. His supplier stalled. A door that used to open with a knock stayed shut. No threats, no warnings, just friction everywhere he turned. Another tried harder, started making calls, asking for protection, promising percentages. His voice carried just enough desperation to spread doubt. By evening, people were avoiding him too. Fear travels faster than loyalty. By the third day, the group stopped meeting together. Started spacing out. Safety in numbers turns into danger once you realize the numbers are being counted. He never contacted them. That was the worst part, because absence gives the imagination too much room to work. They began seeing him everywhere, in reflections, in slow-walking strangers, in the way cars paused at corners. Whether he was there or not didn't matter. The pressure was doing its job. By the end of the week, one of them broke, came forward quiet, spoke to the wrong person hoping for the right outcome. Confession disguised as cooperation. That information traveled exactly where it was meant to. The rest of them felt it the moment the balance tipped. One tried to leave town. Another started drinking earlier than usual. Another vanished without telling anyone. That's how a crew dies in Harlem. Not with bullets, with isolation. And through it all, the man they feared never changed his routine. Still walked alone. Still watched without being seen. Because when the city does the work for you, all you have to do is let it. The last one waited too long. He told himself the others were weak. Said fear made them sloppy. Said he was built different. That's how men talk when pride is the only thing they have left. He stayed, kept moving money, kept making noise just loud enough to sound alive. He wanted it known he wasn't scared. Harlem heard him, and Harlem didn't care. One night walking home, he noticed something missing. No footsteps behind him. No engine idling too long. No tension in the air. That's when panic finally arrived. Because pressure leaving doesn't mean safety. It means the decision's already been made. He turned a corner and found the street empty in a way that felt intentional. Lights working, windows open, too normal. Then he saw him, leaning against a lamppost like he'd been there the whole night. Same calm. Same stillness. Same look that told you this wasn't a meeting. The man didn't move closer. Didn't need to. You had chances, he said. You watched them walk away. The last one tried talking, tried bargaining, tried explaining how it wasn't personal, how he could still be useful. Utility doesn't erase intention. The man listened. Let him finish. Respect is letting someone say their last unnecessary words. Then he shook his head once. You don't understand, he said. This wasn't about what you did. The street felt tighter. It was about what you thought you could do. The last one backed away, hands shaking, looking for exits that no longer belonged to him. When it was over, there were no sirens, no crowd, no story worth telling wrong, just another correction made clean. By morning, his name joined the others, spoken past tense, then not at all. Harlem adjusted, it always does, and the man at the center of it all kept walking his routes, watching the city breathe, knowing the lesson had landed where it needed to because the game never stops. It just waits for the next man to forget why it exists. Years passed, but the rhythm stayed the same. New faces, new money, same hunger wrapped in different suits. Harlem kept evolving, but it never replaced its instincts. It remembered who protected balance and who tried to break it for ego. He got older, not slower. Older in the way generals get older, less visible, more certain. People still felt him before they saw him. Some never saw him at all. Young men asked about him in whispers. Old men answered carefully. Nobody exaggerated. They didn't need to, the truth was enough. Every so often someone would test a boundary, small, almost polite, like tapping glass to see if it's still there. The response was never dramatic. Accounts froze, meetings canceled, allies reconsidered. Men woke up to realize their leverage had evaporated overnight. That's what real power looks like. It doesn't chase you. It removes the ground under your feet. One evening, he stood at a window overlooking a street he'd walked for decades. Traffic rolled, music drifted, life kept going. Harlem wasn't afraid anymore, it was disciplined. That was the victory because fear fades, respect doesn't. Somewhere below, a young man laughed too loud, bragged too much, spoke like the city owed him something. He watched without expression. Not because he planned to act, but because he always knew who would eventually force his hand. Harlem never runs out of teachers, and the lesson is always the same. The loud one didn't know he was being measured yet. That's always how it starts. A voice rising above the room, a laugh that lingers too long, confidence spilling past good sense. People around him smiled, but their eyes kept checking doors. The city noticed before the man did. He kept walking his routes. Same pace, same corners. Letting the noise reveal itself fully, because men tell you everything when they think they're winning. Word reached him in fragments, a name, a circle, a plan that wasn't finished but already sloppy at the edges. Too many promises, too much future spoken out loud, ambition rushing ahead of discipline. He didn't intervene. Not yet. He understood something the loud ones never do. Harlem gives every man just enough rope to explain himself. What happens after that depends on how well he tied the knot. One night the laughter stopped mid-block, not with violence, with attention. Too many eyes turning at once, too many conversations cutting off. The loud one felt it. You always feel it when the city stops leaning your way. He looked around, confused, searching for approval that had quietly expired. From across the street, under a light that didn't flicker, the older man watched. Not angry, not curious, certain. He adjusted his hat and stepped back into the flow of the night, already knowing the outcome. Because by the time a man realizes he's being watched, the lesson is no longer optional. Somewhere behind him, the city shifted again, deciding who would still belong when the noise finally died down. And Harlem, patient as ever, waited for the next mistake. The loud one tried to correct course. That's what fear does once it finally catches up. It doesn't make you smart, it makes you busy. He started cutting deals too fast, calling people who hadn't called him first, promising loyalty he couldn't enforce. The city heard desperation in his voice. That was new. Men who'd laughed with him last week now listened without agreeing. Smiles thinned. Meetings shortened. Someone important stopped returning calls altogether. He told himself it was temporary, said every rise has pushback, said the crown always shakes before it settles. Crowns don't shake, they get tested. One evening he noticed the pattern break. No one blocked him. No one challenged him, no tension, just space. Too much of it. That's when he understood the worst thing had happened. He'd been downgraded from threat to problem, and problems don't get negotiated with. Across the neighborhood, windows stayed lit longer than usual. A few cars idled where they shouldn't. Somewhere, a phone rang and didn't get answered on purpose. The loud one walked faster, then slower, trying to look natural. Trying not to look hunted. Every shadow started feeling personal. He didn't know where the pressure was coming from. That's what made it unbearable. Because the man who truly controlled the board hadn't spoken to him once, hadn't warned him, hadn't even acknowledged his existence. Which meant the decision hadn't reached him yet. It was still moving. And in Harlem, when a decision takes its time, it's never because mercy is leading the way. He finally asked the wrong person the right question. That's how it usually ends. He wanted to know who was watching him, who turned the room cold, who decided he was done before he even understood why. The answer came without drama, a look, a pause, a step back. That's when he knew his name had stopped carrying weight. That night he didn't go home, sat in his car too long, engine off, lights out, listening to his own breathing like it might give him instructions. Across the street, a storefront window reflected movement he couldn't track. A shape passed, then another. He checked his watch. Time felt thick, stuck. Then the knock came. Light, controlled, on the glass beside his ear. Not aggressive, final. He didn't reach for anything. He already knew better. The door opened. The older man stood there alone. No crew, no witnesses, just presence. "You asked a question," he said calmly. "This is the answer." The loud one tried to speak. Words tangled, explanations rushed forward too late. The older man raised a hand once. "Listen," he said, "you weren't dangerous. That hurt worse than any threat. You were loud." Silence filled the car. "Harlem doesn't punish noise," he continued. "It ignores it until it becomes a distraction." The loud one swallowed hard, eyes wet, pride dissolving. "What happens now?" he asked. The older man looked down the street, then back. "Now," he said, "you leave." Hope surged too fast, "and you don't come back." The door closed. The engine started. By morning, the loud one was already gone, and Harlem, satisfied, went back to its rhythm, because sometimes the cleanest ending is letting a man live with the knowledge that he never mattered. People thought that was the end of it. They always do. A man leaves town, name fades, noise dies down, feels clean, feels finished. That's when folks get comfortable, start thinking the rules relaxed with the seasons. They didn't, because the real lesson wasn't about the man who left. It was about the men who stayed and learned why he had to go. Harlem kept moving. New money found new pockets. New players learned old manners. And every so often, someone would ask, quiet, respectful, if the stories were true. Nobody answered directly. They didn't need to. All you had to do was look at how people paused when certain streets were mentioned, how deals got smaller before they got bigger, how men with ambition learned to lower their voices without being told. That's legacy. Not statues, not speeches, behavior. Some nights, walking alone like he always did, he'd feel the city settle around him. Not watching, not waiting, just existing in balance. That's when he knew everything was still in place. Because the moment Harlem stops adjusting itself, that's when something truly dangerous is coming. And somewhere, right then, another man was convincing himself he'd found a new way to win an old game. The city didn't rush to correct him. It never does. It just lets him take his first step and starts counting. The first step is always quiet. That's how men fool themselves into thinking it doesn't count. He saw it in the way money shifted lanes, in how a few runners started asking questions they didn't need answered, in how certain faces showed up twice in places they didn't belong once. Someone new was feeling brave again, not reckless, not loud. This one was patient, the worst kind. He wasn't trying to take Harlem. He was trying to wait it out, betting that time dulls edges. Betting that legends get tired, that's a long bet. He didn't interfere, not yet. He let the man build confidence. Let him believe he was invisible, because invisibility makes people honest with themselves. Weeks passed. Small wins stacked up. The new man started believing the city had gaps, that the old ways had softened, that the guardian had finally become a ghost. That's when he made his mistake. He reached for something sacred, not money, not territory, respect. He spoke the wrong name the wrong way in the wrong room, laughed where he should have nodded, corrected a story that wasn't his to correct. The room didn't react. No gasps, no arguments, just stillness. That's when the city answered for him. Doors closed that same week. Meetings dissolved without explanation. Support vanished in pairs, then in clusters. The new man felt it but couldn't trace it. That's the cruelty of real influence. You never see the hand, only the result. One night, standing alone in an office he'd just paid too much for, he finally understood. He hadn't been overlooked, he'd been allowed. An allowance had just expired. Somewhere else, walking a familiar block, the older man adjusted his coat against the night air. No satisfaction in his face, no pride, just confirmation. Because Harlem doesn't belong to whoever wants it most. It belongs to whoever understands it long enough to protect it. And someone had just proven they didn't. The city leaned forward again, ready to finish the sentence it had already started writing. The city didn't rush him. That's the part that hurt. No threats, no confrontations, just space opening up where opportunity used to be. The kind of space that makes footsteps sound louder than they should. The kind that turns confidence into paranoia one block at a time. The new man started noticing patterns too late. Same cab passing twice. Same stranger standing near different corners. Familiar faces suddenly too busy to stop and talk. He told himself it was nothing. That lie lasted 3 days. On the 4th night he got the call. No name, no greeting, just an address and a time. Neutral territory. The kind people choose when they want to feel safe without earning it. He hesitated. That was new. Across town, the older man already knew he'd accept. Men like that always do. Curiosity and fear pull in the same direction when pride is involved. The night of the meeting, Harlem felt unusually calm. Music lower, streets clearer, like the city was clearing its throat. The new man arrived early, sat alone, ordered nothing, checked his watch too often. Every second stretched. When the door finally opened, it was the man he expected. That's when his stomach tightened, because whatever plan he'd built in his head, this wasn't part of it, and somewhere in the city a decision that had been forming for weeks was finally ready to speak. But not yet. Harlem likes its endings precise, and this one hadn't finished sharpening itself. The man who walked in didn't look important. That was the point. No suit worth mentioning, no entourage, no weight in his step, just someone who belonged there in a way you couldn't explain. The kind of presence that tells you this meeting already happened somewhere else. He sat without asking, didn't order, didn't introduce himself. Silence did the talking. The new man shifted in his chair, trying to regain ground, asked the first question. Another mistake. Where's he at? He said, trying to sound casual. The other man finally looked up. You already met him, he said. That answer landed heavy. The explanation came in pieces. Not dramatic, not threatening, just facts arranged in a way that couldn't be argued with. Routes that were closing, money that would stop moving, friends who would stop answering, not as punishment, as correction. The new man tried to negotiate, offered concessions, territory, apologies dressed up as respect. The other man shook his head. This ain't a business meeting, he said. It's a notice. A notice of what couldn't be said directly. The chair scraped as the new man stood, pride flaring one last time. He said the wrong thing in the wrong tone. The other man stood too, not aggressive, just finished. You've already been decided, he said. You're just catching up. The door opened behind them, not with force, with timing. The new man turned and realized the room had been set long before he walked into it. Outside, Harlem waited, calm, patient, because once the city speaks clearly, there's no appeal left to file. He didn't fight. That surprised him more than anyone else. When the door opened and the weight of the room finally revealed itself, his body understood something his pride had been dodging all night. This wasn't pressure. This was conclusion. Nobody rushed him. Nobody grabbed him. They didn't have to. The men in the room weren't there to threaten. They were there to witness. That's when it hit him, the same realization that breaks every ambitious man in Harlem sooner or later. This wasn't about punishment. It was about record-keeping. What happened next wouldn't echo because of violence. It would echo because everyone who mattered would know. He was given a choice that wasn't framed as one. Leave quietly. Tonight. No speeches. No messages. No lingering connections. Whatever he thought he was building would be dismantled behind him piece by piece, and he'd be allowed to remember it from somewhere else. Or stay. Staying meant becoming an example. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just permanent in the way absence becomes permanent. He chose to leave. Most men do once they understand what staying actually costs. By dawn, his office was already empty. By noon, his name was being corrected in conversations, spoken like it belonged to the past. By nightfall, nobody was asking about him anymore. That's how fast Harlem moves when the decision is clean. Across the city, the older man walked his usual route. Same pace, same corners, same quiet authority settling the streets without announcement. He didn't smile, because this wasn't a win. It was maintenance, and maintenance never ends. Somewhere, another man was already learning the wrong lesson, thinking survival meant permission, thinking silence meant space. Harlem didn't interrupt him. It just waited, because the city always lets you finish your thought. Right before it tells you why you were wrong. That's the thing nobody ever writes down. Harlem doesn't punish ambition. It punishes amnesia. Men forget. They always do. Forget who steadied the ground so they could walk loud on it. Forget that calm streets aren't empty, they're supervised. The older man felt the shift before it had a name. Same as always, a tremor under routine, a hesitation in the city's breathing, nothing broken yet, just stressed. That's when you act, not with force, with placement, a conversation here, a door left unopened there, a favor collected without asking. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it already was. A new rumor started circulating. Quiet. Respectful, not a threat, more like a reminder wearing a fresh coat. Men repeated it carefully, the way you repeat things you believe but don't want to own. It said the city was balanced again. It said the board was still watched. It said the game hadn't changed, only the players had. No names attached, names weren't necessary. One evening, standing where the streetlights blur into memory, the older man paused longer than usual. Listened. Harlem sounded right. Not soft, not tense, just aligned. That's when he knew the lesson had landed, not with fear, with understanding. Because the most dangerous city isn't the one on fire. It's the one that looks calm because everyone remembers exactly why it stays that way. And somewhere far from Harlem, a man who once thought he could win without learning the rules stared at a ceiling he didn't recognize, wondering when the game slipped past him. It didn't slip. It stepped over him. Harlem moved on. It always does. Calm never lasts forever. It just buys time. The city held steady, but underneath it, new footsteps were learning old rhythms. Younger, sharper, raised on stories instead of scars. They didn't want the throne, not yet. They wanted to understand why nobody ever sat on it too comfortably. That curiosity is dangerous. He felt it one evening when a question reached him that wasn't meant to. Not disrespectful, not bold, curious. The kind of question that pretends it's academic but really wants permission. How long can one man keep balance? He didn't answer it, because questions like that aren't looking for truth. They're looking for timing. Across Harlem, a few alliances shifted half an inch. Nothing worth reacting to, unless you knew how far half an inch could become if ignored. Someone was testing patience now, not power. That was new. He adjusted his route that night, just slightly. Took a street he hadn't walked in months, felt eyes notice, felt minds recalculating. Good, let them know the board still moves. From an upstairs window, a silhouette watched him pass. Young, still enough not to be afraid yet. Still foolish enough to think observation equals control. The older man didn't look up. Didn't need to, because the most dangerous phase of any game isn't the challenge. It's the moment right before it. when everyone thinks they understand the rules, and someone decides to test whether the consequences are still real. Harlem was approaching that moment again, and the city, patient as ever, was about to see who remembered what happens next. The test didn't come fast. It never does when someone's trying to be clever. Weeks passed. Nothing obvious broke. No fires, no noise, just subtle overconfidence leaking into places it didn't belong. A meeting held without asking. A deal cut one block too far north. A laugh that lingered after a name that used to end conversations. That's how you know someone's warming up. He didn't stop it. He let it breathe. Let the young ones believe restraint meant fatigue. Let them convince themselves the city had finally outgrown supervision. Because the worst thing you can do to an ambitious man is let him believe he's invisible. One night, a trusted voice brought him a simple sentence. No details, no panic. They think you won't move first. He nodded. That was enough. The move didn't come with warnings. No confrontation, no meeting, no shadowed alley conversation. That kind of drama belongs to amateurs. Instead, the city shifted its weight. A lease didn't renew. A shipment rerouted itself. A favor got remembered at the wrong time. Men woke up to discover their momentum had vanished overnight, not slowed, removed. Like someone had lifted the floor out from under their plans while they slept. Confusion spread before fear did. Confusion always comes first. Questions followed, quiet ones, then urgent ones, then desperate ones. No answers came back, because answers give people something to argue with. Silence doesn't. From his usual corner, he watched the correction finish itself. No satisfaction in his eyes, no relief. Just confirmation that the city still understood cause and effect. The young silhouette from the window didn't appear again. Not because something happened to him, because he understood. And understanding in Harlem is how you survive long enough to stay quiet. The balance returned, not announced, not celebrated, just felt. But somewhere far from the blocks that taught patience the hard way, another man was already telling himself a familiar lie, that he'd found a smarter angle. That this time would be different. The city didn't interrupt him, it never does, it just starts counting again. Counting is patient work. The city doesn't rush numbers, it lets them stack. Let them tell their own story. One misstep doesn't mean much. 2 is coincidence. 3 is intent. By the time the count reached 3, he already knew the name. Not loud, not reckless. Careful enough to think that made him different. Smart enough to stay just inside the lines. Arrogant enough to believe the lines were suggestions. He didn't move on the man. That part confused people. They expected a meeting, a warning, some echo of the old days. They didn't understand that the game had evolved without changing its rules. Instead, the man's world began shrinking. Not fast, precisely. A phone call that used to get returned didn't. A door that used to open stayed locked an extra beat. A face that used to smile now nodded and kept walking. That's how you know you've been noticed. The man felt it but couldn't name it. Blamed bad timing. Blamed competition. Blamed everyone except the truth standing just outside his understanding. One night, standing alone in a room full of plans, he realized something was wrong. Not broken, wrong. The city no longer reacted to him. It anticipated him. That's when fear finally settled in, not sharp, not loud, but deep. The kind that makes you replay conversations you already lost. The kind that tells you there's a hand on the board you can't see. Across Harlem, the older man paused at a familiar corner and listened. The rhythm was off again, just slightly. Enough. He adjusted his coat, looked down the street, and made a decision he hadn't needed to make in a long time. This one wouldn't learn through absence. This one wanted to be seen. And Harlem was about to remind him what that actually costs. He didn't announce the move. That's how you could tell it mattered. When a correction needs witnesses, you make noise. When it needs permanence, you let it arrive quietly and sit heavy. This one wasn't about fear spreading fast. It was about memory setting deep. The man who wanted to be seen woke up that morning feeling watched before he even opened his eyes. Not the paranoid kind of watched, the accurate kind. The kind that tells you something already happened while you were sleeping. His phone still worked. That was the trick. Messages came in. Meetings stayed scheduled. On the surface, nothing had changed. Underneath, everything had. A driver canceled last minute with no explanation. A location he'd used twice before suddenly wasn't available anymore. A name he leaned on for introductions sent back a polite excuse instead of an address. Polite is dangerous. Polite means someone already spoke for you. By afternoon, he started making calls he didn't need to make, checking relationships that should have been solid, fishing for reassurance without asking for it directly. He didn't get any. That's when he understood he wasn't being opposed. He was being placed. The city had decided where he belonged, and it wasn't where he was standing. Across town, the older man moved through his day the same way he always did. No rush, no deviation, but his attention was focused now, narrowed. This wasn't maintenance anymore. This was instruction. He didn't target the man's money first. That would have been too obvious. He didn't touch his muscle either. Muscle gets nervous and loud when it feels threatened. He went after belief. People stopped repeating the man's ideas, stopped defending his vision when he wasn't in the room, stopped using his name as shorthand for momentum. That's how power actually dies. Not when you're attacked, but when you're no longer quoted. By nightfall, the man felt the pressure close in, not from one direction, from all of them, like walls slowly leaning without touching yet. He sat alone in a place that used to feel safe, staring at a board full of plans that suddenly looked childish. Every move assumed cooperation that no longer existed. Every path depended on doors that had quietly disappeared. He poured a drink he didn't finish. That's when the message came. Not a call, not a threat, just a location. No time attached, no signature. He stared at it too long. This was different from before. No ambiguity. No illusion of choice dressed up as patience. This wasn't an invitation to negotiate. This was confirmation that the city had finished counting. He knew better than to ignore it. Men who ignore messages like that don't stay available long enough to regret it. So he stood, adjusted his jacket, looked at his reflection like it might explain where he went wrong. It didn't. Outside, the night felt heavier than usual, not hostile, certain. Somewhere else in Harlem, the older man paused mid-step. He felt it settle. The moment when a man realizes the game he thought he was playing ended before he learned the rules properly. This next part wouldn't be loud, but it would be unforgettable. Because when Harlem decides to be seen, someone always pays for the clarity. And the man walking toward that address was finally close enough to understand what that meant. The address wasn't unfamiliar. That was the first cut. It wasn't some dark alley or abandoned building meant to scare him into obedience. It was worse than that. It was a place tied to credibility, neutral ground, the kind of location men used when they wanted history on their side. That told him this wasn't about embarrassment. It was about definition. He arrived 10 minutes early, not because he was eager, because being late in moments like this feels like admitting weakness before anyone says a word. The door was already unlocked. Another message delivered without effort. Inside, the room was clean, sparse. No windows worth mentioning, just a table, 3 chairs, and a stillness that felt intentional. The kind of stillness that doesn't rush you because it knows where you're headed. He stood there longer than necessary, listening. Nothing, no footsteps, no voices, no signs of life, just the sound of his own breathing reminding him he was still allowed to be here. Then one of the chairs moved, not dragged, adjusted. The older man didn't step out of shadows. He didn't need them. He was already seated, posture relaxed, hands folded like this was a conversation he'd had many times before with different faces. The man swallowed, sat when it felt appropriate, which was immediately. No greetings were exchanged. Silence stretched, not awkward, not aggressive. Educational. "You wanted to be seen," the older man said finally, voice steady, unforced. "That usually means you don't understand what visibility costs." The man tried to respond. Words lined up, then abandoned him. He settled for nodding, a small one, honest. The older man continued, "You weren't wrong about one thing. The city changes, always has, always will." Hope flickered, just enough to be dangerous. "But you mistook change for vacancy," he added. "That's where you failed." The room felt tighter, not smaller, more precise. The man leaned forward slightly, instinctively trying to earn space. "I never meant disrespect," he said. "I just thought." "That's the problem," the older man interrupted calmly. "You thought." No anger in it, no bite, just fact. He stood then, slow, deliberate. Not to intimidate, to end the lesson at eye level. "Harlem doesn't belong to the boldest voice," he said. "It belongs to the quietest mind that still remembers why silence matters." The man's chest tightened. "So what happens now?" The older man studied him for a long moment, not weighing mercy, measuring comprehension. "That depends," he said, turning slightly toward the door, "on whether you're smart enough to disappear or arrogant enough to make me explain this twice." The door behind them clicked, soft, final, and in that sound the man finally understood. This wasn't about punishment. This was about whether he would leave as a footnote or become a warning Harlem would repeat for decades. He didn't answer right away. That pause told the older man everything. Men who understand disappear quickly. Men who hesitate are still negotiating with pride, and pride is expensive in this city. The man cleared his throat, sat straighter, tried to regain posture like posture could rewrite momentum. "I can leave," he said. "Tonight, no noise, no messages. I'll take what I've got and go." The older man watched him the way you watch weather roll in, without judgment, without urgency. "Leaving isn't disappearing," he said. "Leaving is relocation. Disappearing is agreement." The man frowned. "Agreement to what?" "To being finished," came the calm reply. "To letting the city close the book without checking the last page." Silence again. He could hear his heartbeat now, loud, rude, telling on him. He tried another angle. "Everyone does." "I don't want problems," he said. "I respect what you built." The older man nodded once. Not approval, acknowledgement. "Respect isn't what you say when you're cornered," he said. "It's what you practiced before you were noticed." That one landed. The man's eyes drifted to the door, then to the walls, then back to the older man, searching for something. Mercy, maybe, or instructions. People like instructions. They want a checklist that lets them believe survival is earned by compliance. The older man didn't give him one. "You have until morning," he said. "Not to pack, to decide." "Decide what?" the man asked, voice thinner now. "Whether you want to be remembered," the older man said, turning away, "or whether you want to keep breathing somewhere that doesn't care who you used to be." He walked to the door and opened it. The hallway outside was empty, clean, normal. That normality was the last warning. As he stepped through, he stopped without turning back. "One more thing," he said. "Don't say goodbye to anyone." The man blinked. "Why?" "Because goodbyes make people curious," the older man said, "and curiosity keeps names alive." The door closed. The man sat alone with the sound of it. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time felt unreliable now. By the time he stood, his decision wasn't clear even to him. He reached for his phone, stopped, then put it back in his pocket like it burned. Outside, Harlem moved on schedule. Buses sighed. Music leaked from somewhere distant. Life went on, uncaring. But somewhere between that room and the street, a choice was hardening. And whatever he decided before morning would decide how Harlem spoke his name, or whether it ever did again. Morning didn't feel like relief. It felt like a deadline that refused to announce itself. The man left the building before the sun finished deciding what kind of day it wanted to be. He walked 3 blocks before realizing he'd been holding his breath the whole time. Let it out slow, too slow, like he was afraid the city might hear him exhale and take that as a signal. Every step felt heavier than the last, not because anyone was following him, because nobody was. That's the part people never prepare for. When pressure disappears all at once, it doesn't mean you're free. It means the decision has already moved past the point where watching you matters. He went home. That was mistake number 1. The apartment looked the same, too same, furniture where it belonged, papers stacked like they'd been waiting for him. The kind of normal that suddenly feels staged. He checked his phone. No messages. That was worse than threats. He scrolled through contacts he'd leaned on for years. Names that used to answer before the second ring. He didn't call any of them. The warning echoed too clearly now. Don't say goodbye. Goodbyes make people curious. He sat down, stood up. Poured coffee he didn't drink. Packed a bag, then unpacked it, then packed it again differently. Each version felt like it told a different story about who he thought he still was. That's when the doubt set in. What if disappearing wasn't enough? What if leaving quietly still counted as being remembered? He stared at himself in the mirror longer than necessary, tried to see what the city saw, tried to figure out when confidence crossed into permission without him noticing. Outside, a car door closed. Normal sound still made his shoulders tight. He checked the time, still early, too early to be done, too late to pretend nothing happened. Somewhere else in Harlem, the older man moved through his morning like any other. Same pace, same route. Same awareness tuned just enough to notice when the air shifted. He hadn't followed the man. Didn't need to, because the real test was whether the man would leave. It was whether he'd understand what leaving actually meant. Would he vanish clean? Or would he try to anchor his absence with explanations, with pride, with one last look over his shoulder? The city hates hesitation. Back in the apartment, the man zipped the bag and stopped again. His hand stayed on the zipper like it was waiting for permission to move. His phone buzzed, once. No name, no number, just a vibration that said something somewhere had noticed he was still thinking. He didn't open it, not yet. Outside, Harlem kept breathing, calm, patient, uninterested in his confusion. But that patience wasn't infinite, and whatever he chose to do next, open the message, ignore it, walk out the door, or stay put, would decide whether this ended quietly or became another lesson the city would carry forward in silence. He opened the message. That was the moment everything narrowed. No words, no threat, just coordinates, close, too close to feel coincidental, close enough to say, "We know exactly where you are." His first instinct was anger, the second was denial, the third, the one that mattered, was understanding. This wasn't pressure to stay, it wasn't a command to run, it was a mirror. The city was watching how he reacted when no one was telling him what to do. He sat back down, bag still packed by the door, and thought hard for the first time in weeks. Not about plans, not about escape routes, about posture, about whether he wanted to spend the rest of his life checking reflections and wondering if silence meant safety. That's the cost nobody warns you about. He stood, locked the apartment, and didn't look back. Left the bag. Took nothing that tied him to who he used to be. Keys dropped through the mail slot on the way out. Clean, unsentimental. At the corner, he hesitated for half a second, then corrected himself and kept walking. No shoulder checks, no hurry, just forward. That decision traveled fast. By the time he reached the coordinates, the city already knew what kind of man he was choosing to be. The place was open air, public enough to feel safe, quiet enough to feel exposed. A bench, a streetlight. Nothing dramatic. The older man wasn't there. That was intentional. Instead, the man sat alone and waited. 5 minutes. 10. The urge to leave crept in, then passed. Waiting became easier once he accepted that this wasn't a meeting. It was confirmation. Across Harlem, routines continued uninterrupted. Deals closed, streets flowed. Nobody mentioned his name. Nobody needed to. From a distance unseen and unnecessary to reveal, the older man observed the absence where presence used to insist. He nodded once. That was enough. The man stayed on the bench until the sun climbed high enough to erase shadows. Then he stood and walked away in the opposite direction of everything he'd built. No witnesses, no escort, no fear chasing him, just space. Harlem adjusted without noticing. That's how you know the correction worked. But somewhere beyond the blocks that teach restraint, beyond the lessons learned the hard way, another man was already listening to the wrong stories. Stories about quiet streets, stories about fading legends, stories about opportunity disguised as patience. He was smiling when he heard them, and Harlem, patient as ever, didn't stop him. It never does. It just waits for the moment when belief turns into action and starts counting again. The dangerous ones never announce themselves. They listen first. This new man didn't rush Harlem. He studied it like a language he almost understood. He stayed on the edges, asked the right questions to the wrong people, Let others talk themselves into revealing gaps that weren't real. He smiled a lot, too much. Smiles make people underestimate what you're calculating. He heard the stories about calm streets, about how things had softened, about how the city felt different now, less guarded, less tense. He heard the name too, always spoken carefully like it might overhear itself. He decided the lesson was outdated. That was his first real move. He didn't test power, he tested patience. Small encroachments, plausible deniability, the kind of maneuvering that lets you retreat without embarrassment if you're challenged. No one challenged him. That's when he got bold enough to believe he was right. Across Harlem, nothing reacted. That was intentional. Reaction feeds men like him. Silence starves them while they mistake it for approval. The older man noticed, of course. He always did, not the moves themselves, but the intention behind them. The confidence that said, "I think I've solved you." That confidence had ended many careers. He didn't interrupt the new man's rise, didn't block it, didn't shadow it. He let it gather momentum just long enough to become visible to the people who mattered. Visibility is a liability. Soon, the new man started enjoying the attention, letting his name travel, allowing credit to stick, accepting praise without correcting it. That's when the city leaned back and crossed its arms. He held a gathering, not a celebration. A conversation. Neutral ground, respectful invites. He wanted to feel the room bend toward him. Some did, some didn't. He noticed who stayed quiet. He noticed who watched instead of applauded. He told himself that was normal, that every shift meets resistance. What he didn't understand was this. Resistance hadn't begun yet. Elsewhere, the older man adjusted one thing, just one. A relationship that had been dormant. A favor that had been waiting for the right season. He didn't pull the thread, he touched it. The city responded the way it always does when reminded of old agreements. Not loudly, correctly. The new man felt it 2 days later, a delay he couldn't explain, a reassurance that didn't arrive when promised. He laughed it off, told himself growth had friction. Then came the second delay. Then the third. Patterns form whether you acknowledge them or not. He called someone he trusted. Got voicemail. He called again later, still nothing. He told himself not to overthink it. That night, walking home, he felt it for the first time, that shift. That quiet tightening in the air that doesn't belong to weather. He slowed his pace without realizing it. Let the street get ahead of him. Listened to the sound of his own footsteps and how alone they suddenly felt. Somewhere nearby, a radio clicked off. Not dramatic, deliberate. He stopped under a streetlight and checked his phone. No messages, no missed calls. The screen felt heavier than it should have. He looked around, finally aware of what he'd been ignoring. The city wasn't watching him. It was positioning itself around him. And in that realization, cold and undeniable, he understood something too late. The counting had already started. Counting doesn't feel dangerous at first. It feels like coincidence wearing a bad disguise. The new man told himself that as he walked. Same streets, same lights, same Harlem he'd been studying for months. But now every block felt narrower, like the city had leaned in a few inches without asking permission. He passed a corner where he used to be welcomed. Nobody looked up, not rude, just finished. That was new. He kept moving. Confidence is a habit. Even when it stops working, the body keeps reaching for it out of muscle memory. He straightened his jacket, slowed his pace, told himself this was nothing, a pause, a recalibration, but Harlem doesn't pause by accident. At the next block, he noticed a car he'd seen earlier. Same model, same dent near the rear light, parked wrong for convenience, parked right for observation. He walked past it without turning his head, pretending not to care. The engine didn't start. That was worse. He cut down a side street, not fast, not panicked. Just enough to feel like he was choosing something. Halfway down, he realized the street was quieter than it should have been. No radios. No arguments from open windows, no laughter spilling out of doorways. Silence like that is curated. He stopped and listened. That's when he heard it, the sound of footsteps behind him that weren't trying to hide, measured, confident, unrushed. He didn't turn, he already knew better. A voice came from just far enough back to avoid being challenged. "You walk like you still think this is your neighborhood." The words weren't loud, They didn't need to be, he swallowed. I'm just passing through, he said, calm, careful. The right tone for men who understand hierarchy. Late, the footsteps stopped. Passing through means you already stayed too long, the voice replied. He considered running. The thought crossed his mind clean and sharp. He dismissed it just as fast. Running only works when someone cares enough to chase you, and whoever this was didn't sound like they chased. He turned slowly. The man standing there wasn't the one he expected. Younger, ordinary, no reputation attached that he recognized. That made it worse, because it meant this wasn't personal, this was procedural. You didn't do anything wrong, the man said, almost kindly. You just misunderstood something. What? The new man asked. The man smiled faintly, not friendly, accurate. You thought silence meant space, he said. It doesn't. It means the decision already happened somewhere you weren't invited. The new man's chest tightened. So what is this? The man glanced down the street, then back. This is the part where you stop moving pieces. And if I don't? The new man asked, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. The smile disappeared. Then you become one. A car door closed somewhere nearby. Not close, close enough. The new man felt the city settle around him, not hostile, not loud, just decided. Like gravity remembering what it's supposed to do, he opened his mouth to speak. Behind the younger man, another shadow shifted into view, then another. And somewhere, unseen and unnecessary to announce himself, the older man observed the moment the game always reaches, the point where belief finally collides with reality. The new man understood now. The counting wasn't about numbers, it was about how many steps he had left. And Harlem had just finished the math. Nobody touched him, that was the part that broke his rhythm. The shadows didn't rush, didn't grab, didn't crowd him. They just existed, arranged with purpose, like the city had decided where everyone belonged in that moment, including him. He stood there, hands visible, heart loud, realizing something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't confrontation, it was containment. The younger man spoke again, voice steady, almost instructional. You see them now, he said. That's good, means you're still thinking. The new man nodded once, too fast, trying to show compliance without begging. He'd learned enough to know begging accelerates endings. I didn't mean to step wrong, he said. If I did, I'll correct it. The younger man tilted his head slightly. Correction already happened. That sentence landed heavier than any threat. The shadows began to move, not closer, just repositioning. One drifted toward the mouth of the street. Another leaned against a car that hadn't been there a minute ago, exits closing without ceremony. The new man felt small, not in stature but in relevance, like a word being removed from a sentence without affecting the meaning. Here's what's going to happen, the younger man continued. You're going to walk straight ahead. You won't run. You won't look back. You won't try to explain this to anyone later. And then, the new man asked. The younger man paused. Long enough to make the answer feel optional. And then you'll see if the city still recognizes you. That was it. No guarantee. No promise of safety. Just a test framed as mercy. The shadows parted just enough to form a narrow corridor of streetlight and asphalt. A path that wasn't inviting but wasn't blocked either. The new man hesitated. That was mistake adjacent. From somewhere deeper in the block, a sound carried forward. Not footsteps. Not a voice. Just the faint scrape of a shoe against concrete. The kind of sound made by someone who'd been standing still long enough to get impatient. The younger man's eyes flicked in that direction. Then back. Don't make this complicated, he said quietly. Complicated gets remembered. The new man nodded again, slower this time. He stepped forward into the corridor, every nerve awake, every instinct screaming to run and warning him not to. He walked, one step, then another. The shadows didn't follow. They didn't need to. Halfway down the block he felt it, the pressure eased just a fraction, like hands loosening without letting go completely. Permission conditional and thin. At the end of the street he reached the corner and stopped. This was the moment. He could turn, look back, try to understand who'd been there. Try to attach faces to the fear so it felt manageable. Or he could do what the city respects most. He chose forward. As he rounded the corner and disappeared from the block, the shadows melted back into the city's normal posture. Doors reopened. Radios clicked on. Harlem exhaled like nothing unusual had happened. From across the way unseen, the older man watched the empty corner for a long moment. He hadn't intervened. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't needed to, because the real question wasn't whether the new man would survive tonight. It was whether he'd learned enough to survive the silence that came after. The older man adjusted his coat and turned away, already feeling the city shift again, subtle, familiar, unfinished. Somewhere out there, the new man was walking fast now, trying not to run, trying not to think about how close he'd come to becoming a story instead of a person. And somewhere else, far too soon, another man was going to hear the wrong version of what happened on that block and decide he could do better. Harlem didn't argue with that kind of confidence. It just waited because the game was never over. It was only deciding who moved next. He didn't stop walking until his legs started lying to him. That's when he slowed down, not because he felt safe, because he knew better than to outrun fear. Fear likes to chase. Calm makes it lose interest. He blended into the city the way he should have from the beginning. Head down, pace even, no searching eyes. No reaching for reassurance from faces that didn't owe him anything. That was the first real lesson. By the time he crossed into another neighborhood, the tension hadn't followed, or maybe it had, just quieter now. Less obvious, like a shadow that doesn't announce itself because it knows where you're going. He didn't go home. That would have been arrogant. Instead, he kept moving until the city started feeling unfamiliar. New sounds, new rhythms, streets that didn't know his name and didn't care to learn it. That kind of anonymity felt like oxygen after nearly drowning, but relief never came, because relief only shows up when you believe it's over. And he knew this wasn't over. Harlem doesn't end things loudly unless it wants witnesses. This wasn't that. This was something else. A postponement. A warning written in space instead of blood. He replayed the night in pieces, the voice, the shadows, the corridor of light that felt less like mercy and more like a test he barely passed. Every detail stuck, sharp and instructional. What haunted him most wasn't the threat. It was the restraint. That told him there was a line he'd come close to crossing, and that line was still there, waiting. Across town, the older man sat alone with a cup that had gone cold. He hadn't followed the outcome, didn't need updates. The city always reports back in its own way. Tonight it felt balanced, not calm, balanced, like a scale that had been nudged and then settled where it belonged. But balance is temporary by nature. He knew that better than anyone. He stood and looked out at the street, watching people move through their lives unaware of how close some of them always are to making the wrong choice. How thin the margin really is between being allowed and being corrected. Somewhere out there, the man from the corridor was telling himself a story. About survival. About how he'd almost been something important. About how he'd gotten out in time. That story might keep him alive, or it might bring him back. And if it brought him back, the city wouldn't repeat itself, because Harlem is generous once. After that, it remembers. The older man turned from the window, already feeling the faintest tremor beneath routine, too subtle for panic, too familiar to ignore. Another question was forming somewhere. Another belief was hardening into confidence. Another man was mistaking patience for permission. The city didn't rush to correct it. It never does. It just leans in slightly and waits to see who moves next. Confidence is loudest right after survival. That's when men start confusing escape with victory. Start telling the story with themselves at the center, sharper than they were, smarter than the city that almost swallowed them. The man from the corridor kept that story to himself at first. That was smart. Silence buys time, but time has a way of making memory feel negotiable. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing happened, no messages, no shadows, no reminders. That's when the danger crept back in, not from Harlem, but from inside his own head. He started believing the city had tested him and found him acceptable. That the walk he'd been allowed to take was proof of something earned, not something spared. Men do that. They rewrite mercy as respect because respect feels permanent. He moved again, carefully, not back into Harlem's center, but close enough to feel the warmth. New faces. New rooms, conversations that stopped just short of names. He told himself this was evolution. It was drift. Across the city, the older man felt it before it had form. The same way you feel weather change without checking the sky. Something subtle had shifted. A tone, a tempo, a confidence that hadn't been authorized. He didn't react. He rarely did. Reaction gives shape to things that might otherwise collapse under their own weight. Instead, he listened. Let the city tell him who was talking too much again. Let patterns redraw themselves naturally. Harlem always reveals repetition eventually, and there it was. The man wasn't claiming territory. He wasn't moving money. He wasn't even organizing. He was doing something worse. He was telling the story wrong. Telling it like survival meant immunity, like being spared meant being chosen, like the corridor was an initiation instead of a warning. That kind of story spreads quietly. It gives other men ideas, dangerous ones. The older man didn't shut it down immediately. He waited to see who listened, who leaned in, who nodded instead of correcting it, because the story wasn't the threat. The audience was. One night the man from the corridor caught his reflection in a window and didn't recognize the caution he'd once worn. His shoulders sat differently now. Higher, louder. He smiled at the version of himself that had almost learned something. Almost. That's when the city began adjusting again, not around him, ahead of him. A meeting he thought he'd been invited to shifted locations without telling him. A favor he expected came back delayed and incomplete. A name he used casually was met with silence instead of acknowledgement. He felt it but dismissed it. Growth, he told himself, has friction. That lie lasted exactly 3 days. On the fourth night, walking alone, he heard footsteps behind him. Not rushing, not hiding, familiar in the worst way. He stopped. The footsteps stopped too. A voice spoke, not from behind but from the side, close enough to feel intentional. You were supposed to leave the story alone. The man turned slowly. The face he saw wasn't angry, wasn't threatening, just disappointed. And disappointment in Harlem carries more weight than rage. I didn't do anything, he said quickly. That's the problem, the voice replied. You started thinking again. The city felt closer now, like walls listening. From somewhere deeper in the block, another presence made itself known, not stepping forward, just existing. The man swallowed hard, realizing too late what he'd misunderstood. The corridor hadn't been a pass. It had been a grace period, and grace periods expire quietly. Right before consequences get specific. The city didn't need to raise its voice. It just needed to remind him why the first warning had been gentle. And as the night closed in around that realization, Harlem leaned forward again, ready to decide whether this man would finally learn, or finally become, the story everyone else learned from. The city didn't surround him this time. That's how he knew it was over. No corridor of light, no careful spacing, no patience left to interpret as mercy. Just one presence stepping close enough to end the distance that had once protected him. The disappointment in the man's eyes hadn't faded, it had sharpened. You weren't warned twice, the voice said, calm, certain. You were trusted once. The man tried to explain, again. Words rushed out tangled, desperate to reframe what had already been decided. He talked about misunderstandings, about growth, about how stories change when people repeat them. That's why stories matter, the voice cut in. They teach other men where not to step. The city felt closer now, not physically, socially, like doors locking 3 blocks away, like names being erased mid-sentence. Harlem doesn't need to gather to apply pressure, it disperses it. The man's confidence collapsed inward, not dramatic, just gone. He finally understood what he'd mistaken for survival was actually delay. What he thought was respect was tolerance, and tolerance, once abused, turns cold. What happens now? He asked quietly. The answer didn't come right away. That pause wasn't mercy, it was gravity. Now, the voice said, you stop being part of the future. He wasn't touched. He wasn't dragged. He was instructed where to go, which streets not to walk again, which names to forget, which versions of himself were no longer welcome anywhere that mattered. This wasn't exile. This was erasure with boundaries. As he walked away, the city didn't watch him. It didn't need to. The correction had already propagated outward faster than he could outrun it. Behind him, the block returned to normal. Radios clicked back on. Laughter resumed. Harlem moved forward without a pause, but something had shifted permanently. Because somewhere inside that calm, a line had been redrawn, thicker, darker, unmistakable, and the man walking away finally understood the worst truth of all. The city hadn't failed to stop him earlier. It had been deciding how he'd be remembered, and now that decision was locked. By morning, his name felt heavier than it ever had, not because people were saying it, because they weren't. Phones rang and stopped ringing. Messages stayed unread. Meetings he thought were solid dissolved without explanation. Not canceled, forgotten. That's when a man understands the difference between being pushed out and being removed. He tried one last anchor, one familiar door, one relationship that used to mean something. He didn't knock. The door opened anyway. The look he got told him everything before a word was spoken. Not fear, not anger, distance. The kind reserved for people who no longer belong to the same story. "You can't stay here," the man said softly. "Not because you're in danger, because you're done." That sentence ended what pride had been holding together. He left the city the same way he'd entered it, quietly, thinking he was smarter than the rules. Only now, the rules had followed him out, wrapped around his future like a shadow that didn't depend on light. Somewhere far from Harlem, he'd live a long life explaining why things almost worked, why timing was off, why the city was changing, why the legend wasn't what people said. No one would argue with him, because no one would care. Back in Harlem, the streets breathed easy again. Business flowed, voices softened. The balance returned the way it always does, without ceremony. The older man stood where he often did, watching the city move past him like a river that never stops learning its own shape. He didn't feel victorious. He felt finished. Finished correcting this chapter, because power isn't proven by how many men you break. It's proven by how few you have to. Somewhere, another man was already telling himself a familiar lie, that the quiet meant opportunity, that the city had gone soft, that this time would be different. Harlem didn't rush to answer him. It never does. It just waits. And when it finally moves, it never misses. Years from now, nobody would remember the man who thought he almost won. That's the cleanest ending Harlem offers. What people remembered instead was the feeling. That subtle pause before speaking too freely. The instinct to check yourself before assuming the city had forgotten its spine. Respect passed down without explanation, like a habit you never questioned. That was the real legacy. The older man never claimed it, never needed credit. He walked the same streets, slower now but with the same awareness. Watching patterns repeat. Watching young confidence rise and either learn or disappear properly. He understood something most men never do. Harlem isn't ruled by force. It's ruled by memory. Memory of who kept balance when chaos was cheaper. Memory of who spoke softly but moved entire neighborhoods with timing alone. Memory of consequences delivered without noise. Some nights, standing under a streetlight that had seen too much to flicker, he'd feel the city settle around him. Not afraid. Not grateful, aligned. That's when he knew the job was done again, until it was. Because somewhere right now, another man is mistaking patience for weakness. Another voice is rising a little too high. Another story is being told wrong. Harlem hears all of it. And when the time comes, it won't correct loudly. It won't explain itself twice. It won't need witnesses. It will simply remind the city and anyone listening. That power doesn't announce itself. It waits, 3 steps ahead, always.